Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm going to do another one of those short openings of a book. This time, Robert Asprin's Another Fine Myth. And again, this was suggested by a friend of mine because there are two things that I really want to point out in this one. When we talk about the fantastic and making the fantastic part of a believable reality. One of the ways of doing that is making the fantastic seem slightly more mundane while still leaving some space for awe in the reader. And it can be quite a tricky balance. And the opening of this does it so well. Plus, there's the usual points about like what we find out about the character in how they act and how it's related to us or relayed to us. But primarily, this point about how magic is just simply dropped into the world. And you'll see what I mean in a second. One of the few redeeming facets of instructors, I thought, is that occasionally they can be fooled. It was true when my mother taught me to read. It was true when my father tried to teach me to be a farmer. And it's true now when I'm learning magic. You haven't been practicing. Garkin's harsh admonishment interrupted my musings. I have too, I protested. It's just a difficult exercise. As if in response, the feather I was levitating began to tremble and wobble in midair. You aren't concentrating, he accused. It's the wind, I argued. I wanted to add, from your loud mouth, but didn't dare. Early in our lessons, Garkin had demonstrated his lack of appreciation for cheeky apprentices. So this is shorter even than the usual ones that I've been looking at. But there are a couple of big points I want to pick out here. So obviously the first is this character, unnamed at this point, this first person point of view. What do we know about this character? Well, they are an apprentice to a magician. We know more about Garkin, perhaps we're told more about Garkin, perhaps, than we are told about the first person point of view. But we know something about him. Firstly, we know that they are quick witted. It's the wind, I argued. I wanted to add from your loudmouth. We know that they have a sharpness of wit. They've just been corrected on something. They've immediately thought up an excuse and then thought up an insult to go along with the excuse. There's a certain level of wit to that, but also a certain level of rudeness, crudeness, brashness, and one would suggest a lack of civility, which in fantasy quite often is coupled with the level of society from which they come. And of course, that is also communicated by the fact that while it was true that their mother tried to teach them to read, it was true when my mother taught me to read. It was true when my father tried to teach me to be a farmer. So the mother was successful in teaching the character to read. The father was unsuccessful teaching them to be a farmer. And now they are learning magic. So we know that they have been educated, but it was an education from the mother rather than a school or a tutor or anything like that. That gives you a sense of, well, an assumption about the level of society that the character is from. The fact that the father is a farmer and this character didn't want to be a farmer. So it's not that it was a farmer with a bunch of field hands and a grand estate. You get a sense that it's much more father to son or father to daughter to father to heir sort of thing. And therefore, the lower echelons, one is assuming about the society and the background of this character. But the big thing is, it's how being taught to read, being taught to be a farmer, being taught magic, there isn't a major distinction being made between these. They are all just subjects. Being taught to read is no more remarkable than being taught to be a farmer, which is no more remarkable than being taught magic. And because magic is made to have the same level of normalcy as being a farmer, it suddenly makes the study of magic and the inclusion of magic in this story feel a lot more authentic, feel a lot more integrated into the reality. It's not some remarkable, strange, weird, oh, and I'm learning sorcery and this is so different. It's, you know, my mum tried to teach me to read, my dad tried to teach me to farmer, and this guy's trying to teach me magic. It's a list of topics, and there isn't a great distinction between these topics, although obviously there was some sort of preference. Either the mother was a better teacher than the father, or at least it was a preference on the part of the character to learn to read, because the mother taught me to read, the father tried to teach me, but obviously failed. And now we get an insight into this lesson. And then what we have in the lesson itself is you haven't been practicing. It's just a difficult exercise. It's the standard sort of backwards and forwards between a teacher and a pupil about anything: mathematics, geography, physics, chemistry, foreign language, trying to do something that you haven't learned to do yet or learned to master yet. That, yeah, you struggle with it until you master it. And then once you've mastered it, then it's fine. Until that point, it's difficult. And again, it's just being referred to casually, matter of factly. It's not being singled out to be anything special. And this does so much. Just that inclusion of it and treating of magic as if it is normal does so much to tell you about the attitude of the narration here. And while, you know, there are obviously developments in the major narrative itself and how it goes on and things that happen, you can see this technique, you can see how useful it is by including magic along with mundane things, everyday things like learning to read and learning to be a farmer, and just ticking it off on that list. You can see how it does create that very authentic, very normal feel to magic in this world. And then moving directly from that into a standard argument between a tutor, a lecturer, a teacher, and their pupil. It makes this very domestic, makes it very mundane, it makes it mimetic rather than, well, like, we could use the term realistic. I don't like using the term realistic, referring to the inclusion of magic, but authenticity. You can feel the authenticity of this. Another thing here is when we've spoken before about writing and good writing and you know, this very modern presumption and sometimes modern desire for very straightforward very straightforward language in which the reader is given no gloss on anything. The opening sentence here, one of the few redeeming facets of instructors, I thought, is that occasionally they can be fooled. Redeeming facets of instructors hardly trips off the tongue. This is not simplified language, even though it's straightforward, it's not complex, but it's certainly not as straightforward as it could have been. And then when we have, you haven't been practicing, Garkin's harsh admonishment interrupted my musings. I protested. He accused. I argued. Instead of the usual, he said, I said, response, counter response, without even he said or I said. Instead of that reduction and excision of dialogue tags, we actually have quite elaborate dialogue tags here. Harsh admonishment, and even interrupted my musings. Again, it feels kind of grandiose. It feels that this person has a strong command of language, but not necessarily the common day speech. So we get a sense that after being taught to read by their mother, this person has the sort of everyday speech that they use in the street, and then a much broader and more extensive vocabulary that they're aware of from a more academic perspective. It's how they think rather than what they say. And so we see those two different levels of language. So the interiority is reflected in that sort of higher level of literacy, whereas the exteriority, what is being said, is relatively straightforward. But even then, it's just a difficult exercise. It's not, it's just hard, or um, this is tough. Any of those, it's just a difficult exercise. Again, very specific and using exact words. And while they are straightforward, they're not the most simplified forms that could have been used to respond here. But it's coupled with from your loud mouth. So we can see that this character is a little rough around the edges, but certainly has an extensive vocabulary. We see this in how they think, in how they process the information. So I just thought that was like a really interesting opening to a book, where it's the standard apprentice learning magic kind of thing, but it's made so matter of fact. It's made so straightforward that our sense of the story is we just accept that they are learning magic. It's not some weird, mysterious, woo kind of thing. It's, yeah, it's one more subject, and they just happen to find a tutor who's going to teach them magic. It's yet another subject, like reading and farming. And applications of that technique, and you can see it in other books as well, but this is what we talk about authenticity, about integration, about making the reality of this fictional, or sorry, fictive world, making the secondary world feel more real, more lived in, more believable. And part of that is making its existence the base level of reality that the narrative is inhabiting, rather than thinking of it as a strange and bizarre secondary world. This is one of the techniques that you can use. Anyway, like I said, I try to keep these short. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.